Hi folks, it's Dr. Jackson Crawford again, back for Ranch Porch Series Volume 4, I think. This is again just an irregular weekend series in which I'm talking about things that are not directly related to Old Norse myth or language or things like that I normally talk about, but that I think might interest the audience or that I just want to talk about. And in this case, I want to talk about grad school, about applying and going, maybe a little bit of early career stuff, although I probably won't make this that long. The reason I'm addressing it is because I get asked this question a lot, and so partly there's just an efficiency thing in me making a video about it rather than trying to write out the same email 100 times, but also just to kind of gather my thoughts in one place that people can refer to. So one thing to keep in mind, and this is, I don't want to even start addressing the question of whether you should go to grad school or if it's what place is the right fit for you or whatever, assuming that you're pretty sure that you want to do this. One thing to keep in mind is that unlike an undergrad, your professors are not primarily interested in you as someone in the classroom. So you can be a good undergrad just being someone who comes to class all the time and does well on tests and other assignments and maybe writes some good papers. That's great. But as a grad student, you are expected to begin contributing some original work. Maybe not right away in your first semester, but if you can think of yourself that way from the moment you're applying in your statement of intent and the way that you're talking to the professors that you want to work with, you'll give yourself a real leg up, because they're looking for not just someone who will be, attentive in the classroom, but someone who will be potentially a good future colleague to them and a credit to them and to their institution for having educated that person. So instead of, in your statement of intent, saying, I love learning about, I'll just use my own field as an example, but of course, I think this applies to lots of fields. Instead of just saying, I love learning about Norse mythology, I've always been fascinated with Norse mythology, I love the Old Norse language, whatever. The direction to go is really to say, a little bit, well, for one thing, be a little bit more specific. I'm intrigued by several questions of semantics in the Old Norse language. I'm considering investigating, some questions in the semantics of, I don't know, I'll just make this up, of the natural world. Some things about that, like how are plants categorized in Old Norse or something like that. There you have an actual sort of research agenda, even if it's just the seed of one. It still shows the people reading your statement and your application that you are not just thinking about being in a classroom and then being maybe kind of directionless after grad school, but you actually have a plan and a purpose and something that might lead to a master's thesis, eventually possibly to a doctoral dissertation. So another thing about your statement of intent is you really ought to avoid the cliche, ever since I was 5 years old, I have loved whatever. Most of us have interests and hobbies we've stuck with since our childhood. It's not necessarily interesting to read that biography a lot. And that's focused too much on the past. So, it's okay to spend a paragraph. I wouldn't make this your opening or your closing paragraph, but it's okay to spend a paragraph saying, I've loved this for a long time. When I was 16, I wrote my own grammar of Old English or whatever. But don't focus on that. Don't make that the driving force behind your statement or your application. Instead, focus on future tense. I want to work on this. I want to investigate this. And don't be afraid to drop some names. I've been very fascinated with Dr. So-and-so's work on whatever, and I would like to do some follow-up studies or maybe some critical studies or something like that. I don't think there's any harm in naming some names. And if you aren't, if you're writing a statement for one specific school rather than using one statement for all schools, and actually, for reasons I'm not entirely clear on, people often recommend that you just write one statement for all schools. I wouldn't be afraid to mention, so-and-so at such and such school that I'm applying to does work in this field, and I would be excited to work with him or her. Another thing to keep in mind is that you are going to spend money to do this. It does not matter if you get a full ride, scholarship, fellowship, with a stipend, whatever, money is going to get spent. For one thing, a lot of grad schools are in very expensive places, which is going to mean the cost of living is higher than other parts of the country. But also, there is the simple fact that schools are always going to charge you for more things than you think they're going to charge you for up front, right? Textbooks cost a lot. It's not just tuition, right? Parking can cost a lot, or other kinds of transportation if you need that. Be prepared to spend, even if you have a fellowship and a stipend, I would say be prepared to spend roughly the equivalent of a year's salary from a fairly normal paying job just being in grad school. I don't know exactly how much I spent each year. I don't know what average to give you because, well, let me think, what levels of support did I have? When I was at Georgia, for my master's, I had an out-of-state tuition waiver, so I didn't have to pay the extra out-of-state tuition. That was nice. And then I had a stipend as a graduate instructor. I wasn't a TA because I was actually teaching my own classes, so graduate instructor is, I think that was what it was called. This is 10 years ago now, 11 years ago now. And then at Wisconsin, I had a fellowship 2 years. I had a very unusual teaching assistantship 1 year when I was actually working as the live-in teacher in a Scandinavian language speaking dormitory. That was kind of interesting. I don't know if anywhere other than Wisconsin does that in the U.S., at least for Scandinavian. And then the last 3 years, so I was enrolled as a student at Wisconsin for my PhD program for 6 years. And so that's the first 3 when I was actually in Wisconsin, but then I got hired as faculty at UCLA. And those last 3 years, I didn't get any help because Wisconsin wouldn't give me any financial help because I was, making hypothetically a good salary. But again, what's a good salary in Wisconsin kind of isn't in LA. Whatever, I digress. All right. Other things to think about. Your relationship with your instructors in graduate school is not the same as it is as an undergraduate. Again, they're looking at you as a potential future colleague rather than just as someone that, they are more excited or less excited to see in the classroom every, 3 days a week or 2 days a week. And, that your relationship with your advisor in particular can be, it can be almost like a family relationship. I don't want to say paternal exactly, or parental or maternal, but it can be very, I don't know, it could be avuncular or something like that. You do end up having to know this person pretty well and having to spend a lot of time with them, and their opinions about the smallest thing in your life are going to affect you. So try to pick the schools you're applying at by advisors that will probably fit you well, not just in terms of what their professional interests are, but in terms of what their personalities are like. Now, obviously, if you're interested in some very limited field, there may only be a few schools in the world where you can study that field, but still, make at least an informal mental ranking of how well you think you'll get along with your potential advisor by professional and or personal criteria. And don't be afraid to reach out to these people ahead of time. It's usually not considered an imposition. In fact, many faculty are happy to hear from potential grad students. Feel free to ask, are you taking grad students right now? Sometimes they aren't, right? I mean, sometimes someone is on sabbatical, sometimes someone is getting ready to retire, something like that. You want to make sure the person is actually taking grad students. And remember that not all faculty can take grad students. Typically, only tenure-track faculty can be advisors to grad students. And it may be difficult to figure out what titles mean at different schools, but typically you're looking for assistant professor, associate professor, or full professor. And of course, you want to make sure the school actually has a graduate program. For instance, at Colorado, we don't actually have a graduate program in Nordic studies, but we're often reached out to by students who want to study Nordic studies in Colorado, and what do we have to say to them? Keep in mind, too, that if someone says no, or if a school turns you down, or you don't get the deal that you wanted to get, you should not take it personally, because it's very rarely any particular person's fault, if fault is even the word, any particular person's decision. Often it has to do with funding availability, or with some kind of red tape, or just with this thing, that thing, or another thing. There's so much bureaucracy and red tape in schools that you should never assume that a decision was made because you were considered to be just flat out unworthy. Try again if it didn't work out one year. I would also say that if you get the opportunity, depending on your field and depending on schools and depending on the direction that universities are going in right now, I recommend getting your master's and as a separate thing, and then getting your PhD, because if something happens, right? I mean, this is like, even if you're pretty sure you want to get your PhD, getting your master's first as a separate degree is kind of like the prenup of the PhD, right? You may be convinced that you want to live with this field forever, but at some point, something can happen. Maybe you have a change of heart. Maybe you have a disaster, a family emergency. Maybe you run out of money. Maybe the school runs out of money. Maybe, not to be dire, maybe your advisor dies or something like that. Something could actually prevent you from getting that PhD. So I think that it is a good, cautious move to make sure that you are getting the master's to your name first, so that you have something to show for it if something comes between you and finishing that PhD. Again, not all programs are going to allow that, and it seems like that's maybe even a trend right now. But for now, I do recommend getting a master's separate from the PhD, and I would do them at 2 different schools too, because then you get exposed to different faculty with different experience, different expertise, and also you have the opportunity maybe to teach different classes and things like that. What else would I say? I don't want this video to be too long, like I said. On the other end of grad school, make sure as you are approaching the end that you talk with your advisor and other faculty in your department and get an actual good idea about what their daily lives are like. Do they spend a lot of time on paperwork? How much time do they spend on original research versus answering email, right? Versus preparing for classes, versus being in classes, versus grading, that kind of thing. You want to get a good, realistic picture of that, because if there's things you don't know how to do very well, you're going to want to learn those, right? I mean, I would recommend that if you are a good teacher or not, that you read books about teaching or blogs about teaching at least. There's a good book I like called Small Teaching. I can't remember the author's name right off the top of my head, unfortunately, that I find very valuable. Pay attention to the people that you think teach well and copy what they do. Pay attention to the people you think don't teach well and try not to copy what they do. Pay attention to who gets published, where they get published, what directions your field is going in. Stay up with the journals. Have at least half a dozen journals that you check out in the library now and then. At least flip through the table of contents. Figure out what people are doing, because it can be a big problem if you kind of lose track of the pulse of things, especially when you're applying and interviewing for jobs where they may really, really grill you about not just your research, but how it's situated in the wider frame of research going on in your field at the time. So those are some basic thoughts about grad school. I hope somewhat helpful to some of you if you're considering it. Again, big point. When you're applying, remember that you are applying as a future scholar, not just as somebody who's going to be sitting in a classroom for a few years. All right. Well, go forth and be brave. And from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.